October 24th, 1944. The Philippine Sea is a graveyard of burning steel. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is reaching its violent climax. On the bridge of the USS Essex, a radar operator stares at a glowing screen. His heart stops. A massive formation of Japanese aircraft is screaming toward the American fleet. The operator calls it a beehive. There are over 60 enemy planes in a tight, disciplined mass. There are Zeros, Oscars, and twin-engine bombers. They are less than 40 miles away. The American carrier decks are crowded with planes being refueled. If the Japanese reach the task force, thousands will die. There is no time to scramble a full squadron. Only 2 F-6F Hellcats are already in the air with enough altitude to act. The lead pilot is a 34-year-old from Alabama. His name is David McCampbell. To the Japanese, he is just another American pilot. They do not know he grew up hauling heavy loads on a farm. They do not know he has the patience of a hunter. They are about to find out. McCampbell looks at his wingman, Roy Rushing. He keys his radio. Follow me. 2 lone Hellcats turn their noses toward 60 enemies. The greatest lopsided aerial battle in history is about to begin. The morning air over the Sibuyan Sea was crisp and clear. David McCampbell was the commander of Air Group 15. He was already a veteran with 25 confirmed victories. But even for him, the radar report was a moment of sheer gravity. The Japanese had launched everything they had left to stop the American invasion of the Philippines. McCampbell checked his fuel gauges and his oxygen pressure. He was flying a Grumman F-6F-5 Hellcat. This machine was known as the Ace Maker. It was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 10W double wasp engine. This massive 18-cylinder radial engine generated 2,000 horsepower. McCampbell pushed the throttle forward to the war emergency power setting. He felt the torque of the 3-bladed Hamilton standard propeller pull the airframe. He needed the high ground. In aerial combat, altitude is potential energy. He climbed his Hellcat at a rate of 2,600 feet per minute. He reached 22,000 feet just as the enemy formation came into visual range. It was a terrifying sight that stretched across the horizon. The Japanese planes were stacked in layers like a deadly wedding cake. The formation consisted of roughly 40 fighters and 20 bombers. The fighters were a mix of Mitsubishi A6 M5 Zeros and Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars. The Zeros were legendary for their agility and turn radius. The Oscars were even lighter and more maneuverable. But the Hellcat had the advantage of weight, armor, and raw speed. McCampbell's F-6F-5 was protected by 200 pounds of cockpit armor. It featured a 1.5-inch thick bullet-resistant glass windshield. The Japanese pilots saw the 2 lone American planes circling above them. They were flying in a massive defensive circle. This was a Luftwaffe circle. It was a tactical arrangement where every pilot protected the tail of the plane in front of him. It was a flying fortress of interlocking fire. McCampbell realized a head-on attack would be a quick death. He was a farm boy who understood the value of patience and resources. He knew he couldn't waste a single .50 caliber round. His Hellcat was armed with 6 Browning M2 machine guns. Each gun was loaded with 400 rounds of armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition. He and his wingman, Roy Rushing, circled the beehive at 25,000 feet. The Japanese formation was moving at 20,000 feet. McCampbell used the extra 5,000 feet of altitude as a tactical reservoir. The Japanese expected the Americans to wait for reinforcements. But McCampbell knew that every second he waited brought the bombers closer to the USS Essex. He checked his 6 o'clock position to ensure no enemy had snuck above him. The sky was clear. The sun was positioned perfectly at his back. This was the classic beware the Hun in the sun tactic. He signaled Rushing to tighten the formation. McCampbell eased the stick forward. The nose of the Hellcat dipped into a steep dive. The airspeed indicator climbed past 350 knots. The wind roared against the canopy as the engine RPMs hit their peak. He targeted a 0 on the far right edge of the formation. He waited until the Japanese plane filled his entire gun sight. He was now only 200 yards away. He squeezed the trigger on the stick. The vibration of the 6 guns shook the entire airframe. A stream of tracers stitched across the Zero's fuel tanks. The Japanese aircraft did not have self-sealing tanks. It erupted into a ball of orange and black fire instantly. McCampbell did not linger to watch the debris fall. He used his high speed to pull back into a steep climb. He returned to 25,000 feet before the Japanese could even react. This was the boom and zoom. It was a technical application of physics over maneuvering. The Japanese formation began to buckle and panic. They couldn't understand how a single attack could be so surgical. McCampbell looked down and saw the smoke trail of his first kill. He took a deep breath of pure oxygen. He realized the Japanese were so focused on their defensive circle that they were staying slow. They were flying at 160 knots to maintain the tight formation. McCampbell was diving at twice that speed. He was an invisible ghost striking from the glare of the sun. He spotted his next target. It was a Key 43 Oscar leading the middle section. He dove again. The adrenaline was flowing, but his hands remained steady. This was the discipline of a man who had spent his youth in Alabama. He understood that hard work was the only path to survival. He was about to outwork 60 men simultaneously. The sky was about to become a graveyard. He fired a short, half-second burst. The Oscar's engine exploded, sending the propeller spinning into the sea. 2 kills in less than 3 minutes. McCampbell pulled up again, his eyes scanning the horizon for the next opening. The beehive was beginning to break apart. The hunters had become the prey. The sky was a canvas of life and death. The radar blips on the USS Essex indicated a massive threat. McCampbell knew his carrier was in the crosshairs. He had only 7 Hellcats in the immediate vicinity. As the engagement began, the group became fragmented. 5 of the American pilots dove to engage the lower-level Japanese bombers. This left McCampbell and Roy Rushing alone at 25,000 feet. They were facing roughly 40 Japanese fighters by themselves. The odds were 20-1. Most pilots would have called for backup and maintained a safe distance. But McCampbell was not a standard pilot. He understood the concept of economy of force. He knew that if the 40 fighters were left unbothered, they would swarm the American ships. He looked at Rushing's plane. He saw the white numbers on the dark sea blue fuselage. "Roy, we're going to have to keep them busy," McCampbell said over the radio. Rushing simply clicked his mic twice in agreement. They were entering a zone of extreme aerodynamic stress. At 25,000 feet, the air is thin and freezing. The Hellcat's 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger was working at full capacity. The system compressed the thin air to maintain engine power. The Japanese Zeros lacked the sophisticated forced induction system. At this altitude, the Hellcat was the superior machine. The Zero was agile at low altitudes, but it struggled in the thin air. McCampbell was counting on this technical disparity. He was also counting on the Japanese rigid adherence to their formation. The Japanese pilots were disciplined to a fault. They stayed in their tight Lufberry circle, waiting for the Americans to come to them. McCampbell refused to play their game. He initiated a series of high-side passes. He would dive, fire, and climb. This used the Hellcat's massive weight of 12,000 pounds to its advantage. Gravity was his silent wingman. Each dive increased his kinetic energy. Each climb converted that energy back into altitude. The Japanese Zeros tried to follow him. They would pull up their noses to get a shot. but their engines would cough and stall in the thin atmosphere. They would fall away, helpless and slow. McCampbell watched them drop like stones. He was a predator picking off the weak from the herd. He targeted a Mitsubishi A6 M50, leading the second tier. He centered the crosshairs of his Mark 8 reflector sight. He squeezed the trigger. The 6 Browning .50 calibers spat out 40 rounds per second. The Zero's wing root shattered. The aircraft spun into a terminal dive, trailing a ribbon of black smoke. Rushing stayed right on McCampbell's wing. His job was to watch the 6. He kept his eyes peeled for any Japanese pilot brave enough to break formation. Whenever a Zero tried to intercept McCampbell, Rushing was there to drive them off. They were a two-man threshing machine. The Japanese formation began to shift from a defensive circle into a frantic swarm, but they were still at a disadvantage. They were losing their leaders. McCampbell was systematically eliminating the most experienced pilots. He was looking for the planes with the most ornate tail markings. He knew those were the commanders. Without leadership, the 40 planes would become a disorganized mob. The battle was no longer just about survival. It was about psychological dominance. 2 Americans were dictating the terms of engagement to an entire wing. The Beehive was losing its sting, but McCampbell's guns were getting hot, and his fuel was beginning to burn. He was 95 minutes away from a legend. The endurance of David McCampbell did not begin in the cockpit of a fighter. It began in the red clay of Bessemer, Alabama. He was born in 1910, a child of the Deep South during a time of transition. The Alabama farm taught him a brutal kind of patience that cannot be learned in a classroom. Life on a farm is a series of long, repetitive tasks that require absolute focus. You do not quit when the sun is hot. You do not quit when your muscles ache. McCampbell learned to read the land and the weather with the precision of a scientist. This sensory awareness would later save his life in the featureless vastness of the Pacific. He attended the Georgia School of Technology before earning an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy. He was a proud member of the class of 1933. But the Great Depression nearly ended his military career before it even started. The Navy was facing massive budget cuts and had no money for new commissions. Congress passed a law stating that only the top half of the graduating class would receive commissions. McCampbell was in the bottom half of his class. He was honorably discharged into a country where jobs were non-existent. He returned to the dirt of Alabama. He worked as a construction laborer in the sweltering southern heat. He worked in a pulp mill and as a manual laborer on a fruit farm. This period of his life hardened his resolve and tempered his ego. He was a man who understood the value of a single opportunity. He was finally recalled to active duty in 1934 as the Navy began to expand again. He served as an officer on the USS Portland before finally being accepted for flight training. He earned his wings at Pensacola in 1938 at the age of 28. By the time he was leading Air Group 15 in 1944, he was 34 years old. In the world of fighter pilots, this made him an old man. Most of his peers were in their early 20s and relied on lightning-fast reflexes. McCampbell relied on something more dangerous: cunning. He had spent years serving as a landing signal officer, LSO, on the USS Wasp. An LSO's job is to stand on the edge of a moving carrier deck and guide planes down. It requires an incredible eye for speed, distance, and the subtle angle of a wing. He spent thousands of hours watching other pilots either fail or succeed. He became a master of predictive motion. He could tell if a plane was going to stall just by the pitch of the engine's drone. In the cockpit over the Philippines, he used that LSO eye to lead his targets. He did not just fire where the Japanese planes were located. He fired exactly where they were going to be in 2 seconds. His marksmanship was not a matter of luck or volume. It was the calculated result of years of observation. He was a technician of the air who treated every dogfight like an engineering problem. The grit was his ability to stay calm while being outnumbered 40-1. He viewed the massive Japanese formation as a puzzle that needed to be dismantled piece by piece. He approached the beehive with the same methodical pace he once used to plow a field. One row at a time, one kill at a time. He was not prone to the buck fever that caused younger pilots to spray their ammunition wildly. He understood that the air was a medium governed by the laws of physics. He managed his kinetic energy like a farmer manages his winter grain. Waste was the ultimate enemy. Every turn and every climb had to serve a specific purpose. This mental fortress allowed him to remain effective after most pilots would have been physically exhausted. He was now 15 minutes into the most intense combat engagement of the war. He had already splashed multiple enemy aircraft in the Sibuyan Sea. But his greatest challenge was the machine he was flying against. He needed to exploit the specific weaknesses of the Japanese Zero. He was about to put the Grumman F-6F Hellcat to the ultimate test of survival. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was a machine built for the industrial scale of the Pacific War. It was not as agile as the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0. It could not turn inside the tight radius of a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, but the Hellcat was built to absorb damage and return home. It featured 212 pounds of cockpit armor plating. This protected David McCampbell from the 7.7 millimeter and 20 millimeter rounds fired by the Japanese. The Japanese Zeros lacked this essential protection to save weight. They were also missing self-sealing fuel tanks. American pilots often called the Japanese fighters Type Zero lighters. A single tracer round in the wing root of a Zero would ignite the entire airframe. The Hellcat's fuel tanks were lined with a thick layer of natural rubber. When a bullet punctured the tank, the rubber would swell and seal the hole instantly. This allowed McCampbell to fly through a storm of lead without turning into a fireball. The heart of the Hellcat was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. This 2,000 horsepower radial engine was a marvel of mechanical endurance. It featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. This allowed the engine to maintain sea-level horsepower even at 25,000 feet. The Japanese engines often sputtered and lost power in the thin, high-altitude air. McCampbell relied on this raw power to maintain his altitude advantage over the beehive. The Japanese formation was composed of varied skill levels. By late 1944, many of Japan's veteran pilots had been lost. The new recruits were flying in a tight Lufberry circle for safety. This circle was a static target for a high-speed energy fighter like the Hellcat. McCampbell's armament was a wall of steel. He had 650 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns. These guns were harmonized to converge at a point 300 yards in front of the aircraft. He used a specific ammunition belt known as the M2 mix. This included 2 armor-piercing rounds, 2 incendiary rounds, and 1 tracer round. This combination would punch through the engine block and ignite the fuel simultaneously. At this sweet spot, the concentration of fire could saw the wing off a Japanese fighter. McCampbell carried 2,400 pounds of ammunition. He was meticulous about his firing discipline. He never fired long, panicked bursts. He used short, half-second taps on the trigger. This preserved his barrels from overheating and saved ammunition for the long flight ahead. The Japanese Oscars and Zeros used 7.7 millimeter machine guns, which were significantly lighter. They also utilized 20 millimeter cannons, but these had a slow rate of fire and low muzzle velocity. The Japanese rounds often bounced off the Hellcat's armored fuselage without causing structural failure. This disparity in throw weight changed the nature of the engagement. Every time McCampbell pulled the trigger, an enemy plane was likely to be destroyed. Every time the Japanese fired back, the Hellcat simply absorbed the hits. McCampbell understood that his machine was an extension of American industrial capacity. He was flying a tank with wings. The Japanese were flying delicate wooden and aluminum racers. This was not a fair fight. It was a collision between two different philosophies of war. McCampbell continued to orbit at 25,000 feet, watching the Beehive rotate below him. He was looking for the gap in the circle. He noticed that the Japanese were flying at their maximum endurance speed. They were trying to stay in the air as long as possible. This meant they were slow and had no kinetic energy for a climb. He found a section where the Oscars were lagging slightly behind the Zeros. He signaled rushing and tilted his wing into a 60-degree dive. The F-6F-5 screamed as it accelerated toward its third target. The G-forces pressed McCampbell into his seat as the airspeed indicator hit 400 miles per hour. The Alabama Grit was now backed by the most powerful engine in the sky. The slaughter was about to accelerate. The sky at 25,000 feet is a cold and unforgiving laboratory. Oxygen is scarce. The air is thin and provides little lift for a struggling wing. David McCampbell understood that this altitude was his greatest weapon. He held the high ground with obsessive discipline. This was the foundation of his high-altitude trap. The Japanese formation was cruising 5,000 feet below him. They were trapped in a medium-altitude envelope that favored the American machine. The Hellcat was a heavy aircraft, weighing nearly 7 tons when fully loaded. In a dive, this massive weight became an engine of pure kinetic energy. McCampbell used gravity as a force multiplier. He would tilt his nose down and let the weight of the F-6F-5 do the work. This was the boom and zoom tactic in its purest form. He was not interested in a turning dogfight. A turning fight at low altitude would give the Japanese the advantage. The Zero could outturn a Hellcat in a horizontal circle every time. But in the vertical plane, the Hellcat was king. McCampbell would dive at nearly 400 miles per hour. He would strike a Japanese plane and immediately pull into a steep climb. He used the momentum of the dive to regain his altitude. The Japanese pilots tried to follow him back up. This was exactly what McCampbell wanted. As the Zeros pulled their noses up, they fought against gravity and thin air. Their engines began to lose power due to the lack of advanced supercharging. The Zeros would reach the stall point. Their wings would lose lift and their noses would drop. They became stationary targets, suspended in the air for a split second. McCampbell would look over his shoulder and see them hanging there, helpless. He and Roy Rushing coordinated their strikes to keep the Beehive suppressed. While McCampbell dove, Rushing stayed high to provide cover. Then they would switch roles. This ensured that at least one American was always at 25,000 feet. The Japanese formation was forced to stay low to maintain their engine performance. They were effectively pinned against the floor of the sky. McCampbell was the ceiling they could not reach. He was systematically peeling back the layers of the Japanese defense. He was not just killing pilots, he was killing their options. The Japanese could not flee because the Hellcats were faster in a straight line. They could not climb because their engines were gasping for air. They were forced to stay in the circle and wait for the next boom. McCampbell noticed the Japanese were becoming desperate. Some pilots began to break the Lufberry circle in a frantic attempt to escape. This was a fatal mistake. A lone plane was an easy mark for the 6 Brownings. The Alabama farm boy was now a master of the high-altitude trap. He had turned the physics of the atmosphere into a slaughterhouse. The score was climbing, and the Beehive was about to fall apart completely. The clock in the cockpit was the only thing moving faster than the Hellcats. David McCampbell had been in the air for over an hour. The initial shock of the Beehive had worn off, replaced by a cold, mechanical rhythm. He was no longer just a pilot. He was a human computer calculating lead and lag. He checked his 6 o'clock and saw Roy Rushing still glued to his tail. McCampbell spotted a Mitsubishi A6 M50 attempting to lead a breakout to the north. He rolled his Hellcat onto its back and pulled into a vertical split S. He plummeted toward the zero, his airspeed indicator screaming past the 400-knot mark. The Japanese pilot never saw him coming. McCampbell didn't use his reflector sight for his kill. He used the tracer stream method, walking his fire into the Zero's cockpit. The Japanese fighter disintegrated midair, showering the sea with aluminum splinters. That was number 3. McCampbell pulled back on the stick, the G-forces blurring his vision for a split second. He climbed back to 25,000 feet, gasping for the cold, bottled oxygen. The Japanese beehive was no longer a perfect circle. It was now a disorganized mass of 30 fighters struggling to stay together. McCampbell and Rushing dived again, this time targeting 2 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars. The Oscars were incredibly light and began to weave in a frantic S pattern. This was a classic Japanese defensive maneuver. McCampbell didn't follow the weave. He fired into the empty space where the Oscar would be in 3 seconds. His .50 caliber rounds caught the Oscar in the engine cowling. The magnesium in the incendiary rounds ignited the oil lines instantly. Number 4 was a plummeting torch. Rushing called out over the radio, "Leader, you got 2 on your tail." McCampbell didn't panic. He knew the Japanese Zeros couldn't catch him in a high-speed dive. He pushed the nose down further, exceeding the structural limits of the Hellcat. The airframe groaned, but the Grumman-built steel held together. He left the Japanese pursuit in the dust. He then pulled into a high yo-yo maneuver, coming back around to the top. He found the original Japanese flight leader. The leader's plane was painted with a distinctive red stripe on the tail. McCampbell realized that killing the leader would break the remaining Japanese morale. He lined up the shot with the precision of an Alabama marksman. He waited for the Zero to fill his entire canopy. He squeezed the trigger. The leader's plane exploded with such force that McCampbell had to fly through the debris. Soot and oil smeared his windshield. Number 5. David McCampbell was now officially an ace in a day. But he wasn't counting kills. He was counting minutes. The sky was littered with smoking trails and falling wreckage. The Japanese formation was finally breaking for the coast of Luzon. They were abandoning the bombers they were supposed to protect. McCampbell signaled Rushing for another pass. His guns were blistering hot, and his ammunition cans were feeling light. The beehive was retreating, but the farm boy wasn't finished. He was about to enter the most dangerous phase of the fight. He was running low on lead, but the enemy was still in his sight. David McCampbell checked his wing-mounted ammunition counters. The numbers were dropping into the red zone. Each of his 6 Browning M2 machine guns had started the mission with 400 rounds. After 5 confirmed kills, he had expended over 1,500 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. His guns were now extremely hot from the sustained firing passes. Heat causes the steel barrels to expand, which can lead to a cook-off or a mechanical jam. McCampbell felt the vibration of the guns change as some of the belts began to run dry. He signaled to Roy Rushing that they were entering the danger zone of their supply. The Japanese fighters were no longer in a defensive circle. They were fleeing in small groups toward the safety of land-based anti-aircraft fire. McCampbell refused to let them escape. He spotted a group of 3 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars flying in a low-altitude V formation. He knew he couldn't afford a missed shot or a long burst. He decided to close the distance to point-blank range. He dove until he was less than 100 yards from the trailing Oscar. He could see the oil stains on the Japanese pilot's tail surfaces. He squeezed the trigger for a fraction of a second. Only 2 of his 6 guns fired. The others were empty. The concentrated burst of armor-piercing rounds struck the Oscar's cockpit. The aircraft veered sharply and hit the water at 300 miles per hour. That was number 6. McCampbell shifted his aim to the second Oscar in the group. He was now so close that the Japanese pilot's propeller wash buffeted his Hellcat. He tapped the trigger again. A single gun sputtered and died. The final belt of ammunition was feeding through the leftmost wing port. The rounds found the Oscar's fuel line, and the plane erupted in a bright flash. 7 kills. McCampbell looked at Rushing. Rushing was also low, but he still had enough for one more engagement. They spotted 2 Zeros trying to hide in a bank of low-lying clouds. McCampbell used the last of his kinetic energy to cut them off. He was out of ammunition in 5 of his 6 guns. He had perhaps 50 rounds left in his final weapon. He lined up the 8th target with the focus of a man who had nothing left to lose. He fired the last of his steel. The Zero's engine seized, and the pilot bailed out into the Sibuyan Sea. Number 8. McCampbell continued to pursue the final Zero, using his aircraft as a psychological weapon. Even with the empty guns, he performed a high-speed pass just feet above the Japanese pilot's canopy. The Japanese pilot, believing he was under a new attack, panicked. He pulled his stick back too hard, causing his aircraft to stall and spin into the sea. This was a maneuver kill. Number 9. In 95 minutes of combat, David McCampbell had destroyed 9 enemy planes. He was now flying a 7-ton glider. His guns were silent. His fuel warning light was glowing a steady, ominous red. He had to find the USS Essex in the middle of a darkening ocean. The legend was written, but the landing was not guaranteed. The adrenaline began to fade as the silence of an empty gun bay set in. David McCampbell scanned the horizon for the USS Essex. The Pacific Ocean is an unforgiving desert of blue when your fuel needle is on the peg. His F6F5 Hellcat was burning its final gallons of high-octane aviation gas. He finally spotted the wake of the task force in the distance. He didn't have enough fuel for a standard landing pattern. He bypassed the stack and headed straight for the carrier deck. The landing signal officer, LSO, saw the battered Hellcat approaching at a steep angle. McCampbell lowered his landing gear and dropped his tailhook. The engine sputtered and coughed as the last drops of fuel entered the cylinders. He hit the deck with a violent thud, catching the third arrestor cable. The aircraft jerked to a halt, and the engine died instantly. He had landed with exactly 2 gallons of fuel remaining in his tanks. The deck crew rushed to the aircraft, expecting to find a wounded pilot. McCampbell climbed out of the cockpit, drenched in sweat, but physically unhurt. The ordnance men opened his wing bays to replenish his ammunition. They stopped and stared in disbelief. Of his 2,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, only 2 rounds remained. He had fought 40 Japanese planes and destroyed 9 with surgical efficiency. The farm boy had calculated his resources down to the final second and the final bullet. The mission of the 24th became the stuff of naval legend. David McCampbell's 9 kills in a single flight remains a U.S. Navy record that has never been broken. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity. He finished the war as the Navy's ace of aces with 34 confirmed aerial victories. His success was not just a result of his flying skills. It was a victory of technical discipline and American industrial armor. He had used the Hellcat's weight and supercharged power to outthink a numerically superior foe. The boy from Alabama dirt had mastered the most complex machine of his era. He proved that grit and physics are a more potent combination than raw numbers. David McCampbell didn't just survive the beehive. He dismantled it one calculated shot at a time. If you found this breakdown of tactical air combat insightful, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel to see more technical deconstructions of history's greatest legends. Leave a comment below. Was it the pilot's grit or the Hellcat's armor that truly won the day? Share your thoughts, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.